Welcome to episode 2 of the Normless Performance series. I'm Gaj Ravichandra.
Fantastic to have you on the podcast, mate, and the first one for the year.
So exciting. Happy New Year.
2024, and no better way to kick it off than a bit of mindset mastery with the guru yourself. Now, when we both jumped onto Zoom, I saw in the background there you had plenty of greenery behind you. Now, what I'm sensing is that's got something to do with the human emotion and calming your employees down. Is that what it's all about? Is that what the office space with all the greenery there is all about?
Yeah, you're not just a pretty face, are you, Hayden? I think, look, when you look at the science behind colors and emotion, right? Blue and green, right? It's not a surprise to people, right? Blue and green tend to be associated with the most amount of relaxed state, right? And so I couldn't get blue. I would have loved to have the Harbour Bridge and, the harbour in the background there for you. The next best thing is to have, a bit of greenery. And so this is a garden wall, and it's actually, I can't tell you how many people have commented on the fact that it makes them feel relaxed. So I'm glad you picked it up, mate.
Yeah, it's a nice touch. And for me, the blue comes from the ocean. I love getting down to the beach throughout the summer. And I know you're generally based in Dubai, but you're in Australia at the moment. Have you had a chance to get to the beaches throughout summer?
Yeah, I did actually. So we went up north probably a couple of times early part of this year in January. So that was fantastic. And it was so lovely to get out there. And I don't spend as much time as I'd like to. When I'm in Dubai every day, I walk on the beach. So that's my meditative state, right? So I enjoy that.
Today is going to be all about techniques, skills, and strategies that the listeners can use to develop a stronger mind in the new year 2024. Now, before we dive into the nitty gritty and all of the skills and key learnings that people can take away from yourself, I think it really is important always to set a little bit of context. Although we're not focusing on that in this series of the podcast, I think it is important to set the scene, and it all goes back to your name from birth. It was almost written in the stars, like a bit of serendipity with your first and last name. So, did you want to tell the listeners a little bit about what your name means in Hinduism and what relevance that has for you in your career?
Yeah, absolutely, mate. I think it is quite funny, right? When you look back on these things and where you end up. And so my first name, Gajanan, is the full name, is actually another name given to the Hindu elephant god, Ganesha. You might have seen with the elephant trunk. He's the remover of obstacles, right? That is in Hinduism, there actually is only one god in Hinduism. I think everyone thinks there's all these gods in Hinduism. There's one god, but there's all these other little gods that have been created to basically to help explain, right, how the role of God, right, to people. And so, yeah, remover obstacles was my first name, and it was a bit ironic, right, that I got into psychology, and my day-to-day life is built around helping people to remove obstacles that are getting in the way of their happiness or their success. And then Ravi Chandra, my surname, is actually sun and moon, right? And so it's very much about those two forces coming together as well. So sometimes we have what we think are opposite forces that might need to come together, and I find that so many times, I'm sure we'll get into some of that today, that there are repelling forces that actually we might be running away from one thing. Like, for example, you might be running away from failure, but then maybe we need to have more access to success, right? And so finding that balance, is so important.
Have you spoke to your parents about that name? I guess what were their careers? Was there anything that went through your mind about growing up that they were doing with their life that pointed you down this track towards psychology?
Yeah, look, I think I once spoke to a mate of mine who said to me, are all psychologists just people who've got damaged backgrounds and histories, and you're just trying to solve your own shit? Is that what's happening? And I said, yeah, probably. Yeah, there's probably an element of that. No, look, I think look, I had a very fortunate, upbringing, and my dad's an engineer, so he was very much hugely left brain analytical, right? He used to build airports, so he was involved in Perth International Airport and other places. Um, my mum is the exact opposite, right? So she's hugely emotional,
Right.
right? And I think that's where a lot of my interest actually came from. And I looked at these two individuals who are the biggest role models in your life, right, when you're growing up, and they're the exact opposite to each other. And they somehow managed to make it work, right? They're almost inseparable, right? I mean, they know how to have a go at each other, right? Let's be clear. But at the same time, they also are completely interdependent, right? And so I thought that was really quite interesting, right? That combination. And I think that was really how I got interested in sort of personality and human behavior from a kid's age. I think as I started reading a little bit more, I started to see the impact that it has and how it impacts everybody. So I found that fascinating.
I guess from your background growing up in northern Sri Lanka, um, what were the opportunities like when you were growing up? Was moving to Australia? I know when you were 4 years old, but um, why the move? Why particularly the move to Canberra as opposed to Sydney? I know your partner grew up in Sydney, and you guys moved to Canberra. Talk us through, the early days there. I'm sure you couldn't remember a hell of a lot of it, but
I'm super impressed with your research. I feel like I'm having an interview with ASIO. Um, you know, um, so I left Sri Lanka when I was 4 years old, and I think the reason we left was because of the civil war, that was taking place,
right,
right, in Sri
okay,
Lanka between the sort of Tamils at the time that were living in the north and east, and then the Sri Lankan government. And so I don't have many memories, unfortunately. I've gone back a few times since, and obviously tried to reconnect, with
that
the
was the early
country.
80s, 1980s would have been.
Yeah, it was 82
Okay,
when we arrived. So yeah, 4 years old back then, and we came straight to Canberra because that's where my dad had an older brother who was working there at the time, and then he managed to get a job, with the aviation authority and so forth. So I think for us, mate, I don't have many memories.
mm,
That is something that I think I want to rectify, particularly for my children, right? To have a bit of a connection. Obviously, we're very fortunate to be in Australia, but also, fortunate to have a connection and an ancestry with Sri Lanka. And I think that's something to explore. Have you ever been to Sri Lanka before?
I haven't. No, I've never been
Oh,
to India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. I think their
yeah,
places definitely.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think you'd love Sri Lanka. I think it's there's just everything there. And in fact, what I've heard is on the east coast of Sri Lanka, where there are massive waves, there are a bunch of Aussies who have set up surf
Oh,
camps.
really?
Yeah, so it's not a bad place to go.
Yeah. I used to do a fair bit of that when I was younger, but I don't know how I'd go now. I'm about 120 kilos or so. I just stick to the gym floor, but
Yeah.
definitely love getting in the water, love swimming. So yeah, but I'm not a lot of my friends and family that have been over there, yet they come back and don't know anyone that hasn't avoided Delhi belly. Have you got any tips or strategies yourself on avoiding that? Imagine bottled water is one of them, but yeah, is it hard to avoid that kind of thing over there in Sri Lanka as well?
Yeah, Sri Lanka is not too bad. I think Delhi belly is much more, I find, in India. You tend to find that because of the sort of the amount of food that isn't necessarily clean or available in sort of clean sanitary conditions that you can choose as street food. For us in Sri Lanka, it's not too bad. I think most people will tend to eat out of hotels and pretty decent quality restaurants and that kind of thing. So I think I'm slightly biased, right, when it comes to Sri Lanka versus India. So I think I know where I'd be holidaying.
I think a lot of what you talked about there, a lot of the context in which you talked about growing up, well, not growing up, but I guess your initial start in life was in Sri Lanka, northern Sri Lanka.
Mm.
Um, and we talk about the classic definitions of what it is to be, mentally strong or mentally tough, and dealing with things like stress and pressure and all those things that we as humans experience on a day-to-day basis as we progress through life. Um, Do you think that your initial entry into the world and the circumstances with which you were brought into the world was a nice, you could say, introduction to stress, pressure, and that was the initial stages of your development as a person into a career in psychology, or was that something that came a bit later on in life?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think, what do they say that, sort of 70, 80% of your personality is formed in that first sort of 9 or 10 years, right?
Yeah,
So, obviously there was some element of, those early years playing a role. I think when you're a young immigrant child and you're coming into a new country, having to learn a new language, I think all of those things obviously teach a sense of resilience, right? And adaptability, right, to new situations. I think it was more my parents, right? Sort of watching them and seeing them. I think, as kids at that age, we all learn through osmosis in lots of ways,
yeah,
right? So we're kind of absorbing and hearing even conversations the parents were having as they were trying to work themselves out, right? As sort of adults. And I think that would have all had an impact. And I think the curiosity for me was always around how, as an immigrant child, you have dreams,
mm,
right? And I grew up in a housemate where, and this is not an uncommon story for a lot of us, right? Growing up in Australia and other places, um, where you have these two extreme worldviews. One, which is you're told you can achieve anything, right? It's this abundance mindset, right? Dream big, right? Aim for the stars, right? And on the other side, we have this, kind of scarcity mindset, right? Where you got to be careful about money, you got to be careful about your time, you got to be really sort of diligent about certain things. So you got to balance almost these two extreme kind of situations, right? And as an adult, I found that really fascinating, that perhaps it wasn't in the front of my mind to have to balance those things. And as I got a bit older and got into psychology, I realized that these are two different parts of our brain, right? That in fact, the scarcity mindset really comes from this sort of the brain, whereas the abundance is the mind, right? And so you have these two different things, the brain and the mind, which one is responsible for survival, right? The brain, that is what has kept us going for hundreds of thousands of years as Homo sapiens. And then we have, the mind, which is evolved. It's been upgraded through software, right?
yeah.
And you can make that better. And that is really the abundance piece. That is the unlimited opportunity, right? And I'm sure we'll get into some of this today, but when I talk to people who genuinely have this abundance mindset, like they are, they've achieved all sorts of success in different parts of their life, there is no ceiling to what they can achieve, right? And so, I find that fascinating that they've been able to tap into this mindset, and sort of almost steer away from this survival approach, right? Worrying about the day-to-day stuff.
I think there's a lot of things that like this that I want to learn from you today, not just for the listeners, but also there's some things here that I want to touch on too that I want to learn a little bit more about. And one of those
Mm.
things is if you're dealing with people who have an abundance versus scarcity mindset, if you have two different people in a workplace setting, managing their emotions, or someone who, different working styles, different, how do people collaborate better? Showing empathy for other individuals and their own mannerisms, learning styles, emotional sensitivity. But how do we learn to interact better with people, understand how they work, and how can this influence, more positive relationships within the workplace as well?
Mm. It's like a $1 trillion question, right?
Hard, isn't it?
I was looking at this stat the other day, man, that said, it was actually a CNBC report that came out in October last year that said that, we are generally more unhappy today than we were during the pandemic. And that it's costing, because of this sort of general unhappiness with each other, with sort of ourselves, that it's costing something like $8.8 trillion a year on the global economy. That is 9 to 10% of the global GDP, right? So it is the fact that we are sometimes not able to get along, sometimes that we are unhappy, and finding difficulty in managing ourselves and other people is a real issue. A couple of things that I found that might be helpful, right? The first is understanding each other, right? We all come into work with an emotional backpack, right? It's an invisible emotional backpack. We carry shit in from the day, right? By the way, can I swear on this podcast? I should have asked
Go
you
for your life, mate. No holds barred. Just shoot, straight shooter. That's what we love.
Excellent, excellent. And so, this idea that we come into work, right, with all this stuff with us, right? Some of it personal, some of it professional, whatever it might be. And when we're not attuned, right, to our own emotional backpack and to the emotional backpack of other people, right, then we start to get some tension and issues arising. A lot of that has got to do with, do I understand Hayden's values and motivators? What is important to Hayden, right? What actually drives him? What makes him tick, right? Do I even know that about him?
Yeah.
And when you know that, you know what buttons to push, right? You know
Yeah.
how to perhaps get the most out of that person or to be able to connect with
Yeah.
that person, right? The next part is that in any sort of environment, there's typically going to be conflict, right? There's going to be disagreements, right? Now, if we assume that disagreements are bad, right, then we're going to run away from them, right? The issue with that is that improvement, right, doesn't happen unless you've crossed the line, right? Until you know what your boundaries are, right? And so then you've got to cross the line. You perhaps got to make some people upset or irritated or disagree with you or whatever it might be,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so you got to push yourself a little bit on that. And I think that is really important. I think the other thing is also around this sense of why you are there, this sense of purpose and meaning, right? I've seen people who literally go to work 8 hours a day and they are data entry clerks, right? They literally sit there and they punch numbers, from bank accounts and so forth, details, right? They walk out of there, they're super happy. They're just happy, right? Because what they've done is that they have connected what they do to something much more bigger than them. It could be about their customers. It could be about the fact that what they do is going to allow them to go for a holiday, maybe to save enough money to be able to buy an engagement ring to propose to their girlfriend. I mean, there could be lots of things, right, that are happening. But if you don't have that sense of purpose and meaning, I've talked to many traders, many investment bankers, many other professionals who are miserable, right? They're just not happy about where they are in their life, right? And so they've kind of lost that purpose or meaning. And so you got to really engage with that. And that's really important.
So you need to kind of find your silver lining as to why you're doing something. I think for me, I'm working on a systematic review on my thesis at the moment, and it's very much like that data entry. So at the moment, we're extracting the data from 116 randomized control trials, and I'm just punching all those numbers into a spreadsheet, right? But as you say, I can kind of connect the dots as to what this looks like in the grand scheme of things, how this is going to benefit, I guess, the research landscape in the implementation science space moving forward. So it brings me joy. It brings me a sense of personal development, but also impact in terms of the greater good. I think one thing that I find in particular for me that's really important is the environment, along with the actual work you're doing itself and how it brings you meaning. But for me, something that is really important for me, if there's a festering issue within an environment, that's potentially what will unsettle me. And for people who are working in a job that they really love, or something they're doing that is they're really passionate about, but they have a workspace environment which could be considered toxic or problematic. Maybe they don't get along with some of their employees. How do they navigate those situations, even if they do have that passion, say with the example you used for those working in data entry or data collection?
That's a good question, man. I think this kind of connects back to those sort of values and motivators, right? If you're in environments where your values and motivators are not aligned, right, you're really working an uphill battle, right, to kind of make things work. And I think one element tied to that is a lot of the work that Amy Edmondson out of Harvard did, in the 1990s around this psychological safety, right? The idea that you should be able to come into work or whatever environment it is and be able to say what you want to say without this fear of being humiliated or punished, right? And if you're kind of in that environment, right, a number of things are going to happen. One is you are not going to give your best, right, in those environments because you're not going to push yourself, right, to some sort of extreme version. You're less likely to take risks, right? To try new things and to have a bit of variety in what you do. You'll probably stick to the safety path, right, in what you do. The other thing which is really interesting is also around the idea of collaboration, right? If you don't feel safe, you're not going to collaborate, right? You're going to be sticking to yourself. You're going to be probably less likely to want to be in a team environment with people, right? Because you don't trust them, right? And so, that trust piece, and knowing your peeps around you, right, is really important. And so that toxic environment piece, plays a massive role, and particularly with your manager, right? I mean, the stats are so clear on this. Study after study, it is, 60% of your reason, to stay or leave, right, with an organization is the relationship you have with your boss,
Okay.
right? And if you do not have a healthy relationship, you are more than likely going to look elsewhere, right? And there is so much talent that walks out the door in businesses as a result of that dysfunctional relationship.
Yeah, and it's something. It comes back to one of those psychological models that I've talked about in recent episodes, but the self-determination theory of motivation, the autonomy, competence, relatedness. A sense of autonomy in what you do, a sense of competence that you feel a sense of ability to do the work that you've been given. And then obviously the relatedness component is really important too. So feeling a sense of belonging within the workspace.
Mm.
Uh, I guess, are there any tools, strategies, or insights that you can provide that may help, whether it be managers or leaders in the workplace out there listening to this podcast, that they may be able to integrate within their teams to foster a stronger dynamic?
Yeah. So I would say let's start with trust, right? The first thing is about really getting to know your team and understanding who they are and what is important to them. So getting to know what those values and motivators are, perhaps a little bit about what those individuals want to achieve, right? On a personal level, perhaps as well as a professional level, right? And as you start to do that, you start to create a sense of where these individuals want to place their focus and time, right? And we call this job enrichment, right? The idea that you will take on tasks that make you feel better about yourself, that actually play to your strengths, right? And therefore increase the level of productivity that you have, right? So if you don't know those things about your people as a leader, you're tapping into the wrong resources in each person, right? And so that awareness, I think, is really important as a leader.
Awareness to develop some more competency, a sense of competency within your employees.
Yeah, and also the awareness of what is strength, right, within your employees, and where are they going, right? Why are they working so hard? Why do they bother turning up to work, right? Understanding those fundamental things and to build a connection and to build trust is really important. I think one of the things that sometimes as leaders we don't do is also understanding some of the frustrations and putting ourselves in the shoes of our people, right? So for example, this is about what are the things that are getting in the way of our teams being successful. So this is about commitment, right? What is getting in the way of us committing and delivering on what we need to deliver on, right? And if you as a leader, I think your job as a leader is to do mostly two things, right? One is to remove the obstacles that are getting in the way, right, of your people. And the second thing is to reduce the amount of uncertainty that your people are feeling, because uncertainty is the evil force, right, that distracts people from the mission, right? So your job as a leader is to bring certainty to uncertain times. And I think that part is so critical, considering, I mean, look at the chaos that we are in, right? In virtually every country around the world, whether it's around politics, war, economy, all sorts of things, right, that's going on. So if we don't bring that level of certainty as much as we can, our people are going to be exhausted, right? Having to deal with that level of uncertainty, the level of anxiety, right, that they're facing.
Yeah, some really interesting insights there. And I think there's definitely some relatable things there. I know what you're talking about, how trying to find those strengths. Everyone within the team has certain strengths, and finding jobs or tasks they can work on to foster or improve their own sense of competence can really improve their personal self-efficacy and sense of passion, which we were talking about before, which is when you have that purpose in your work, you're more likely to stay within your role.
Mm.
What about for individuals? So I guess that's more of a macro, on a macro level for managers overseeing a whole team. For the individual, if they are struggling within a certain environment, are there any tools or strategies they can use to maybe work with communicating with their employers better, or going, within themselves internally to develop stronger coping strategies?
Mm. Yeah, so I think one of the key competencies or capabilities as a professional, or as anyone who is out there, whether you're a student, whether you're in the workplace, is around this idea of that mental toughness and resilience,
Yep.
right? And for us, we use this framework that comes out of the UK from AQR, which is the 4C model, right? So commitment, confidence, challenge, and control. And I think, that element that you spoke about, man, around that self-determination, right, really connects to this life control piece, right? Do I believe that I am the driver of my destiny, right?
Yeah.
Or am I the victim? Am I the passenger that's sitting next to the driver, right? And things are just happening to me, right, on a regular basis,
Do you think though,
right?
guys, do you think this is on a continuum or it's distinct? Because in my personal experience,
Mm.
I think personally I've run into issues becoming too much of a driver.
Absolutely. And in fact, we have a term in psychology, we call it strengths overdone, right? So when you take your strengths and you take it over the edge, right? It is absolutely possible then for them to become toxic to yourself and to other people, right? They become what we call derailers, right, to your path to success. So absolutely, man. In fact, let's take control as an example, right? If you're the bus driver, right, and you kind of enjoy being the bus driver, there are some situations, for example, where you may be learning a new skill, right, or developing something new, where you might need to step aside and to listen, observe, and be a participant, right, rather than actually driving the bus. And so in those cases, absolutely, right, you're going to have to decide situation by situation. In most situations, however, I find there is a general rule that I tend to stick to, which is, an old adage from a sports psychologist who helped the Poms beat the Aussies in the Ashes many years ago, who said it was about controlling the controllables.
Yep.
So whether you're a victim or you're a passenger or you're a driver, ask yourself the question, right? What is in my control? And make sure that I can at least attend to those things. There may be, in some situations, not many things that I can control, right? And that's okay, right? That happens, that's life. But in situations where you have got some things in your control, maybe it's about, I'm going to control how well I listen, right, to the person giving instructions, right? I'm going to control how well I participate in this particular discussion, right, and observe as opposed to speak, right? So there'll be certain things that you can control, that you should focus on as well.
Also, in terms of people, in your own life. So if we look at the keys of resilience, or the 3 to 4 C's of resilience, so life control and emotional control,
Yep.
commitment, challenge, and confidence.
Yes.
Do the same rules apply when you say, too much of those strengths can actually lead to become weaknesses? And I
Yeah.
guess, can you maybe talk us through those C's and how we can relate them to our own life?
Absolutely. So if you think about, so I think life control we spoke a little bit about, right? Emotional control is about managing your own emotions and the emotions of other people, right? It's about choosing the right level of intensity that you need, in terms of how you manage those emotions and other people. So in the case of strengths overdone, right? If you're really high on emotional control, it may be hard to connect with you. You may not really show much emotion on your face in the language that you use, the words you use. So it may be that, we need to sort of manage that a little bit, right? And if you think about a continuum, you might slide up and down that continuum depending on where you need to be. Commitment, right? So commitment is about, sticking to the task until it gets done, using goals, for example, having structure, right, around how you get things done. Now, of course, when you're overly committed to things, right, you might become a bit like, an Elon Musk, right, where you end up sleeping in the office right? Where you're expecting everybody else around you, right, to be on your personal mission to get to Mars, right? And it may not be everyone else's mission, right? It just may be yours, but they're just there because they want to help you, right? And they need a job and they want to be able to put their kids through school, right? There could be lots of reasons, right? And so, when you're overly committed, that can absolutely be an issue. And that can also result in burnout, right? Pushing yourself to the limits. Of course, there's the extreme on the opposite side, right? When you're not sort of focused, when you don't have goals, when you're kind of laissez-faire, right? You're kind of just turning up to work. Let's see what happens today, right? You don't know what's going to happen. So I think finding that balance, depending on the environment you're in and the intensity that's required, is really important. Challenge is the other one, right? So challenge is about, do I learn from the past? Am I willing to take risks in what I do, right? And of course, we all know what it's like, the global financial crisis, people taking extreme risks, putting, severe debt packages together and so forth, just didn't work, right? And then we've got confidence. And confidence is so interesting, right? Because I think for a lot of us, and particularly if you consider yourself a high performer, the research is very clear, right? That 70% or so on average of high performers have imposter syndrome, right? Or imposter experiences, if you like, that they have to take on board. And so how do you manage your confidence in a way that serves you and the people around you, right? Do you believe that even if you don't have the answers to things, that you are able to find that out? You're resourceful enough, right, to be able to get there? And also, are you able to stand up for what you believe, right? And to use your voice in the right way at the right time. So all those things can be really helpful.
I'm finding that too, with the imposter syndrome, it gets more pronounced as you go up to. So the more you grow, the more I experience that imposter syndrome. Do you have what are some strategies in that respect, I guess, to ground yourself, whether it be, say you're walking into a meeting room with someone that you idolized as a child and you never thought you'd be in the same room as them, working with them on a project or something of that nature. What kind of techniques can we use to kind of manage our anxiety in that respect?
I remember speaking to a tennis player about this a couple of years ago, and it was really interesting. So they'd just gotten onto the ATP tour, and they were about to go up against one of their teenage idols. They used to have posters of this guy up on his wall, all right, on their walls at home. And he was talking about the idea that he was not looking forward to the match, right? And firstly, he didn't want to get defeated. That was the first one of the first few sentences that came out of his mouth, right? And so almost that lost mentality, right, coming straight into the conversation. But also that he held this person in such high regard, right, that he didn't want to disappoint them in their eyes, him in their eyes, right? And so you've got these competing things kind of going on, right, that are kind of really interesting. And one of the things that came up in the course of that conversation was about the fact that that person was actually there on the decline of their career, and they were actually on the incline. They were just starting, right, to get going. And so putting yourself in the shoes of other people to kind of know, what do you think they would have gone through, right, in a situation like this? It's almost depersonalizing the experience, right? It's almost becoming a little bit mechanical about looking at that. So distancing yourself from the emotion, right?
Like a timeline as opposed to,
absolutely. Right? That can be really helpful, right? To kind of do that. The other thing, man, is thinking through, well, what are some of the benefits, right, for me, as I go through this process of improving, right? And I have a mate of mine, Alan Nielsen, used to play for Tottenham, and Bayern Munich used to talk about this idea of the 1/3 rule, right? That you should always surround yourself, as you continue to climb up any sort of structure, whether it's sport or work or wherever, 1/3 of the people you hang around with should be worse than you in terms of performance, capability, knowledge. 1/3 should be your peers, your contemporaries, but 1/3 should be better than you. You should always be spending time with people who you consider mentors and people who you're aspiring to kind of get to in different parts of your life, right? And I think one of the challenges that comes up as you climb whatever ladder it is, there's less and less people, right? As you go higher and higher. And so finding those role models, finding those mentors, right, is not just an activity you do when you're just starting out, right? It's got to be something that you keep maintaining and managing. It's a bit like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, right? You maintain those relationships and you keep finding other people, right, that you learn from, that, you know, that can support you.
One of the things that I'm interested too is as life goes along, obviously we've only done this life experience once, haven't we? So, you
Yeah.
know, as you go along and you're growing as a person, the people and your friends around you are changing. And this is a little bit different to a workplace environment, because in a workplace environment, obviously you're trying to maintain professionalism. You're trying to maintain a kind of consistent environment where you can work within without, you know, overstepping the mark. Now, in a friendship setting or a relationship setting with those that are closer to us, as people change and evolve and grow, so as you're saying there, if we're going up and we have friends along the way, you know, that aren't kind of growing with us.
When you spend more time with people who are connected to you on your values, um, I think that naturally the elements of trust and confidence, all those things sort of kick in, right? And so you're more likely to be yourself in
Right.
those situations.
Okay.
Because what happens is when you're wearing these masks going out into the world, right? You know how everyone says, oh, you got to be an authentic leader. You got to be, you know, yourself wherever you are. It's like, what a crock of shit, right? As if that is what is actually required of people, right? From situation to situation, you've got to determine how you need to behave to bring out the best, not only in yourself, but also in the people around you, right? That's what a leader's job is, right? And it could be self-leadership, right? And so the idea that, you know, you just bring your true self to everything that you do, right? I've never seen anyone successful do that. Right. And the reason for that is that because it is situationally based, right? The great leaders, the ones who understand what is going on and are able to connect to the different environments they're in, are able to very quickly decipher what is actually happening around them. And then they decide what version of me, it's not like they're being disingenuous. It's just what part of me needs to come out here, right? To show who I am, right? And so I think there is this really interesting conversation happening at the moment about this whole idea of authenticity and, you know, being who you need to be consistently all the time in every situation. I'm yet to meet a person who does that, and I don't think you actually need to, right? I mean, I think values-wise, I can understand, right, that you perhaps need to be consistent in your values. But in terms of how you speak, some of your actions and so forth, you might choose to modify those, right? Now, some people might say, well, you behave this way in that situation and then this way in this situation. Well, that's because the situation required that of me, right? And so, yeah, I think being selective there.
Friendships should be transactional. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, let's look at friends. What are friends? If I was to ask you, man, what is a friend?
A companion, someone who you can relate to, who, as I said, shares the same values, and you want to spend good quality time within your life.
Yeah, so I think the statement reflects a lot on the individual. Right. And so, you know, your statement reflects on you, and that individual statement reflects on them, right? So the fact that they're looking at friendship, for example, as transactional, within that statement lies a bunch of clues. Right, about what they're looking for, what is important to them, right? Perhaps by transaction, they might mean, I just want it to be easy. I want it to be binary, like it starts and finishes, right? I don't want to have mess, right, when it comes to those kind of things. So everyone's interpretation of that. So you might look at the word transaction, right, and say, oh, there's nothing deep, right? Why would you want to have a friend? It's just like literally, you know, hi, bye, what's going on, and then just we kind of walk away from each other, right? There's nothing invested, right, in the relationship. But so I think friendships, we need to serve people through our friendships, and friendships need to serve us, right? Now, sometimes that can be transactional. That's what we might need from the friendship, right? There are going to be some friendships that serve that purpose, right? Now, what you might be referring to, maybe that definition, that's why I was asking you, what does friendship mean to you, right?
Yeah, yeah.
For him, it may be less about values alignment. It may be more about a service or a need,
Yeah.
right? That's kind of required. Whereas for you, it seems to be much more of a holier connection, right? That you're
I think that
looking.
aligns with my love language too. I've talked about this with my partner, but it's more about for me, words of affection, whereas for her, it's more about acts of service. I think
Mm,
for different people as well, that could be said, I guess, for like friendships or rather than just, romantic relationships as well.
yeah, absolutely. And you can apply that in the workforce as well, right? That, when you think about what actually motivates and inspires people, those love languages can also be very interesting, right?
Yeah.
As a form of connecting,
Yeah.
with people.
Right.
Yeah, so I think we're all different like that. I think the
Yeah.
interpretation of the word also makes a big difference, right?
Okay.
Um,
So life control and emotional control. So controlling the things that are in your power to control, commitment towards your goals or your life endeavors, having some form of challenge, understanding what this looks like for you,
mm,
and the confidence to believe in what you set out to do. Some really good kind of framework there for developing your own resilience. Um, do you have any other awareness tools to capture more of an understanding about these kind of processes and how we can better develop ourselves psychologically to handle navigating these different relationships? Because I'm sure you've had similar circumstances in your life, and it can be a really challenging process to navigate, particularly when you've held on to specific work relationships or friendships for a long period of time, and you've really put your heart and soul, say, into working for an organization.
mm. Yeah, so there's a couple that I use at the moment that really help me. So one is about this idea that discomfort is different to safety,
Okay.
right? So I think a lot of us confuse the two. In fact, biologically, physiologically, we have very similar reactions, right, to things that make us feel uncomfortable and also unsafe, right? Because the body is trying to protect us from something. The brain is trying to protect us from something, right? The issue is that if we engage the mind, right, in most cases, we're not running away from a lion, a tiger, or a bear, right? We're kind of pretty safe, but
Yeah.
we are perhaps uncomfortable, right? And now it's through that discomfort that learning happens, right? If you think about all the times in your life, man, that, when we first sat down and maybe learned the times tables or had to learn a piece of history or, you're working on your thesis, right? That discomfort that can take place is an indication that something is changing or evolving, right, within us. And so that doesn't mean that we're unsafe. Our body tricks us, our brain tricks us into thinking we are. So that was one important thing for me is I
Right.
asked myself, I'm feeling uncomfortable here and I'm also safe,
Right.
right? So it's okay for me to keep going,
Right.
right? And kind of pushing through this sort of limit here, which is important. The other thing which I find is helpful is also having the right people around you, right? And you
Yeah.
know how we have that old adage that says you're the average of the five people you spend time with. You know that
Yes. Yeah.
comment, right? It's not just the five people you spend time with, it's the five people that occupy your mind, right? So, what are the conversations that are happening in your head, right? Who are you listening to? Now we've got these things called podcasts,
Yeah.
right? Now that occupies
Yeah.
our headspace,
Yeah.
right? So, who are the five people that I'm listening to right now, right? That are occupying that headspace? In a lot of cases, quite frankly, people on those podcasts occupy much more headspace than my wife, right? And so I'm starting to become more like the average of those five people than I am perhaps in a relationship with my wife, right? And so you got to start thinking about where is that occupying of space taking place, right?
So
It's not just the physical.
what I'm assuming you're saying there too is more about thinking about the settings or the podcast, for instance, the media you're consuming. So if you're listening to a certain number of podcasts,
Yeah,
picking carefully what kind of messages or things you are trying
yeah,
to cram into your brain for that that period of time. That
yeah.
bandwidth you have is only a certain length. So
Absolutely. So important. The other thing I tried to do is to avoid this binary or sort of singular sort of view on something. So for example, if I believe that Democrats are better than Republicans, right? For example, right? A liberal is better than Labor.
Yeah.
What I try and do now as a part of practice is I try and spend time listening to the opposition view.
Right.
I force myself,
Yeah.
right? And I try and put myself in their shoes, right? Because one of the things I've realized, man, and I'm sure you've caught on to this well before I did, right?
Yeah.
Which is no one wakes up in the morning trying to have a shit life, right? They just don't, right? But it happens to them.
Yeah.
Right. And they end up in arguments, in jail, in conflict, in all sorts of things, right? And so what's happening leading up to that is perhaps a consequence of what is happening in our minds. And, you know, there is that cognitive cycle that runs all of our lives, right? It is the basic human hardware that runs all 8 billion people on the planet, right? Our thoughts affect our feelings, and our feelings affect our behavior, right? That is the simple cycle that every single human being has. Now, if you want to learn true mastery, the individuals who have learned the shortcuts, right, on that cycle are the ones who have mastered pretty much everything that they can, right? So if your behavior is not helping you, so for example, let's take Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg, right? They're building a company. One of the reasons they used to wear the same clothes all the time, right, was linked to this thing called decision fatigue. Have you heard of that?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. So the idea that anything that takes you away from making decisions on the core things that you actually are needed for is a waste of time, right? And so therefore, build a routine, right? This is why routines are so important. They reduce the amount of decisions that you need to make, right, in things that are not important, right? So if, for example, you want to go to the gym every day at 6 o'clock in the morning, right? Have your gym bag as a system set up in your car so that when you are ready to go, you simply go into your car and you drive to the gym. You don't have to sit there and find your clothes and do all this stuff that ends up taking extra bandwidth, right? It's already done. And so it's creating these things that actually makes a difference. So if you want to adjust your behavior, find out what the feelings are, work backwards, right? How am I feeling about that situation? Do I feel angry about it? Am I frustrated? Am I anxious? Right? And then what is it that I'm telling myself? What are my thoughts in those moments that's causing me to feel this way? Right? And when you address the thoughts, that's when you start to have mastery, right, of anything. And so controlling those thoughts affects your feelings, and those affect your behavior. And the cycle continues around and around, right? So when you feel like the behavior is not right, or you're not feeling right about something, check your thoughts. And that will give you a sense, you know, what am I telling myself in that moment, right? And then you create the shortcut, and that can help you.
Yeah. Now, I'm someone who loves to work hard, but I understand that there is a need for time to switch off. And I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that do relate to this idea as well, that finding the time to switch off and making switching off part of your routine. Because for someone like me, I love editing the podcast videos. I love working on the PhD. I love, working with clients and that kind of thing. And I love work. And sometimes, the work keeps me up, keeps me going. So I love it, but I also recognize it's really important to take the time to replenish your batteries, reset. How for people who are like myself, who struggle to kind of switch off from their work, what kind of strategies would you give or recommend to utilize in order to maybe create a bit more routine about that process of switching off?
One of the best ways to do it is that if it allows you to do what you love even more intensely, then it can be a great motivation, right? So getting that break and having that rest, if it's connected to something that you are actually passionate about, right, or interested in doing, and it's going to allow you to do it better, right? That is a great way of looking at it. I tend to find, this concept of burnout and, not taking care of ourselves. when you're deeply involved in something you are passionate about,
You never hear anyone talk about this on podcasts or and with associated with burnout. But if you actually enjoy something, does it mitigate that
it
element?
does.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll tell you why. It's because it actually gives you energy as well as takes energy, right? So if you imagine your day is like an energy ATM, and I think you might have heard me talk about these sort of energy ATMs
Yeah, yeah.
perhaps in the past. But if we've given a certain amount of energy each day,
Mm.
now through the course of the day, we're drawing energy, right, to kind of get stuff done, right? Now, what happens if we don't deposit energy during the day? What happens at the end of the day?
Flat
You're
line.
bankrupt, right?
Yeah.
Energy bankrupt,
And
right? However, if you're doing something you actually give a shit about, that you're interested in,
yeah.
right, that actually fires you up, that gets you excited, guess what you're doing? You're depositing energy into that energy ATM as well, right? And this is why a number of us, we can go home after a full-on day, right, and still feel pumped up to do even more. Like
Yeah.
the laptop's still open like half an hour later, right? And we're still pounding away on stuff, right? Because our energy is there, it hasn't been depleted. We believe in what we're doing, and there is something bigger than us, right, that we are working on, right? And there's a lot of people out there who they don't have that, right? And so when they look at you and they'll say, what do you mean you worked 13 hours today? Right? That's insane. Well, but I really enjoyed what I did.
Yeah.
Right? And it's amazing how many people, mate, don't have that connection
Do you
with
think
what
this
they
is
do.
something we should be promoting more? I guess there's the idea of restoring your energy levels when you worked, like say you're working too hard, versus
Mm,
as we talked about at the start, finding something that you are really passionate about. You can connect the dots between why you're doing something versus
yeah.
the greater purpose behind it, or the silver lining for you and your purpose or
Mm,
your life.
mm.
Do you think that's maybe something that is not spoken about enough, that could be one of those strategies to kind of alleviate that idea of burnout? Find something you
Yeah.
actually enjoy yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like all of us, right? When we're engaged in work or something that even, you know what it's like when you're surrounding yourself with people who you just don't get along with,
Yeah.
right? It sucks your energy, right? And
Yeah.
you walk away from those interactions depleted, right? You might have been sitting down just having a coffee the entire time, right? You haven't done anything,
Yeah.
right?
And so this is actually a really interesting point you make, because for me, part of me socializing is working on projects with people that I really enjoy.
Yeah.
So, for instance, we're starting now another podcast with a bloke of guys that I used to train with at another gym.
Mm,
And one thing that I kind of yearn for is that camaraderie that we had within the gym. And I love. There's a few other
mm,
podcasts that I listen to that are very similar in that nature, but passionate about something, and you can align that with someone else and work
mm,
towards something with them. I think that's when I kind
mm,
of in the past have fostered the most fulfilling relationships in my life.
mm. Yeah. And I think, you're probably going through growth, right, in those
Yeah.
conversations as well. And I find that growth is probably the better goal to try and achieve than something like happiness,
Right.
right? Happiness is transitory,
Yeah.
right? It is between two periods of sadness,
Mm.
right? And therefore, what is the better objective, right, to look for that is probably going to last longer? And
Yeah.
so growth is a never-ending thing, right? And so when you're on that path to growth, and so for example, you sitting around with your mates talking about these projects, having these discussions, you're stretching each other, you're pushing each other. Obviously there's a strong values alignment typically there, right? That's taking place. All of that is providing energy to
Right.
you, right? And so therefore you can work harder in those moments, right? In those areas, because you're depositing as well as taking,
Yeah.
right? So it's almost like it's cost neutral, right? In some cases. Now, some people might listen to this part of the podcast and say, what a crock of shit, right? Everyone gets tired. There's going to be things that you need to do. And absolutely, you need
Oh,
to have your sleep. You need to have your right diet and your exercise, right? That goes without saying. We're assuming that those are things that are being controlled physiologically, right? That you need to manage. When it comes to the general nature of the day and the content of your day, right? And what you get involved in, that stuff has to be aligned,
yeah.
right, to these things that are giving you energy, right? And I think the risk of burnout then dramatically reduces, right, as a result of that.
I think you say this was more psychological burnout, physiological
Mm,
tiredness and fatigue. I think if you're undersleeping, obviously, and you're doing vigorous exercise 7 days a week without multiple sessions a day without any
Mm,
rest, we're all going to run into periods of fatigue. You look at professional footballers and athletes, and they always have an off season period. And I can understand there's that for that period of physiological restoration, also psychological. But I think that
mm,
if you got any footballer on this podcast with us, Gage, and you asked them when they finish the season, if you went on the Penrith Panthers team and you asked them once they finished the season,
mm,
say they went off to Bali or Fiji and they had a couple of weeks holiday, they came back, what are you looking forward to, or what's
mm.
in your mind at the moment? I imagine, at least 70% of them would say, I'm looking forward to getting back on the field with the boys and training again. You
Yeah.
always hear that, excited for the next year. So that passion and that drive, I imagine, would sustain them. You put anyone else in there who was not passionate about what they're doing, and the chances are they'll burn out, or I think that's a really interesting point of discussion we've made today, that
Yeah.
will get people thinking about what they're doing maybe, and question whether they're in the right environment or following the right path.
Yeah, and something that's typically bigger than them, right, mate? So in the case of the Penrith Panthers, right, they're obviously helping each other. They're mates. They're working towards a common goal,
Yeah.
and purpose, right? And so it's not just their individual gain, right, that they've got there. And I think a lot of people, where that burnout comes from is they're working on something for themselves, typically, and they don't necessarily see the bigger picture, right, and how it's contributing. And so if I don't get what I want from that situation,
Yeah.
right? And there's all the there could be financial pressure, there could be time pressure, there's all sorts of other things that are going on.
Yeah.
Finding those connections to things bigger than yourselves can really help you push well beyond, right? And we see this all the time when it comes to high performance.
And you could say in that Penrith Panthers team too, there's almost a higher level of connection, not only in a team environment, but also in that community. I've spoken about it on previous podcasts too, but the Mount Druitt Penrith community,
Yeah.
they've brought in, there's that Samoan, Tongan,
Mm.
a cultural demographic in that area.
Yeah.
That religious element to it, where they, a lot of prayer time before and after games.
Yes.
There's been a really strong buy-in from the community as well. And I think that their
Mm.
purpose is greater than the team itself, but more associated with the area. And I think,
Mm.
yeah, you connect the dots here with about what we've been discussing, and it really does kind of all come together in terms of, not necessarily all about happiness, but more about
Mm.
growth, passion, and development. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that sense of, when you think about some of these players, one of the big mistakes that I find that people make, that really limits their potential, is that they focus a lot on that final outcome,
Right.
right? So, for example, if your final outcome is, I got to get my thesis done, right? I got to get this PhD,
Yeah.
right? And you keep telling yourself, this is what I got to get to, right? We know that, right? You know that,
Yeah.
right? You got to get to that point. But if you're not in love with the journey of getting there,
Yeah.
it is super painful, right? And so there are elements that are going to be, if you break down obviously that goal,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? What are the parts that you are in love with? What are the parts that you're actually going to enjoy along that
Yeah.
journey, right? Because when you get to the end, mate, and Johnny Wilkinson, when he kicked that winning goal against the Wallabies, right, in the World Cup, he said when his foot hit the ball and it went over, that the drop kick went over and they won the World Cup, England won the World Cup, he was depressed. From the moment his foot hit the ball hit the foot, right?
Really, that's an exaggeration. No.
Yeah, I think it might have been a slight
Oh.
exaggeration, but when he was on the podcast, talking about it, he said the reason is this is about fulfillment. Fulfillment means that you're just filling something, and once you fill it, that's it. It's done, right? It's all the stuff leading up to it that actually is the richness in our lives.
Yeah.
Right?
I think it's more about, it's the process, right? It's
it's the journey.
the journey.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong though, like I'm sure Johnny Wilkinson would have been popping champagne and he would have been celebrating like a madman.
Yeah, you feel
He
really
would have
sorry
got
for him,
depressed.
right? Yeah, it would have been a tough gig, mate, celebrating for 4 days.
I think it's important to celebrate successes as well. It definitely
Absolutely.
does.
Absolutely.
Hey, you've had your fair share of struggles too. So before you developed Compass. It was a real big step for you going out on a limb to set up this business. And one of the questions, and you might want to talk us through that story too, in terms of, the 7 a.m. call you had in your previous employment and all the emotion you saw amongst your fellow employees and staff, and how that triggered you to get into psychology and leadership and growth and development. But what kind of, yeah, I think let's take a step back. Let's have a chat about that. So when you found yourself leaning into becoming a psychologist, you were working that job, 7 a.m. call. You came in and the manager was, I guess, telling people that there was no longer needed.
This is the Speedo manufacturing plant northwest of Sydney. Yeah, they were basically told in a stand-up meeting that 60 odd people on the factory floor were going to be let go that morning because they were moving to Vietnam. I think the fact this was going back 20 odd years ago, right? I was an intern psych at the time, and you got to see a whole bunch of reactions from people, right, when that happened. And I think it was the first time I really got to see mental toughness in action. I didn't know it was mental toughness, right, at the time. I didn't have that terminology. But certain people were, they broke down into tears. Some people were catatonic, they were frozen from the shock. Some people were throwing chairs around out of anger and frustration, right? And so look, I think it always fascinated me working with people, particularly when they were losing their jobs, right? And that's how I got into the psychology piece, was really through outplacement, career transition, and that work, because I felt that there was a lot of humanity that was missing when that separation process took place, right? When someone's asked to leave an organization, I mean, we see this with all the tech firms now, right? Some of them are being told via text message and email, right, that they're no longer required, right, within the business. There is a deeply dehumanizing experience that takes place, right? And you are typically at your lowest point professionally when something like that happens, right? And I wanted to help people. I didn't want people to feel that they were at their lowest point. In fact, I wanted them to see the opposite, which was, right, you're actually not meant to be here. There's something else for you. We need to find out through some sort of structure how you're going to get to a better place, right? And so that was exciting, right? And we had to turn the mindset of people around. And so I think that part for me, was a wonderful part of, becoming a psychologist, was realizing how powerful the mind could be in the worst situations that a person might have had to deal with, right? Professionally. So I think that extended itself to many things, in the world of work, but also, when we set up Compass, 10 years ago, leaving the corporate world, the safety, right, of the corporate world, or the perceived safety of the corporate world, was a big risk. And I remember that first 12 months was probably the most stressful, for me. And I needed to really start applying a lot of my own principles, right, that you tell other people about to yourself, which is always much more challenging. And it wasn't until, mate, I got to that thinking of what is the greater purpose, right? What am I actually trying to give to my clients? What am I trying to give, to the team, to my family? Those were much more important conversations I needed to have, right? And I think when I started having that more regularly with myself, things started to fall into place.
I think what we were talking about with dealing with people and potentially having that lack of trust in bringing employees on, but also understanding that people are going to support you. They're going to help you scale your business as well. A lot of people can have that attachment to their business, but often I think that's the limiting factor in growth. And then we can apply that like metaphorically to some of the principles of your teachings and what we've just spoken about. So from the business growing itself, but also you as a person, was that something where you learnt on the go and had to apply a lot of these principles that you had learnt in your own reflections, but also in terms of growing Compass?
Yeah, I think life is the best teacher, right? And so, there's a whole bunch of stuff that it lands differently when it's happening to you.
Yeah.
And I think that is the biggest thing for me, right? And so I think, going through the experience of setting up a business, and particularly a business, it wasn't here in Australia, right, where it's a lot more comfortable, procedures are established, you've got a track record and history of doing things. We set it up in Dubai, right, in the Middle East, in a free zone, in a place where, you don't have necessarily the support, right, that you might have in a place like Australia. And so I think a lot of those things, you needed to build a tribe, a group of people around you very quickly, right, that you could trust.
Yeah.
And you also needed to learn. You needed to gather as much information and knowledge as quickly as possible and be open to that. And it was super uncomfortable, right, through that process. And I think, we go through moments, right, where you feel comfortable,
Yep.
and then something gets thrown at you that makes you feel uncomfortable, right? And it's kind of that cycle, and that continues.
Yeah, and so I guess going through that process, like when you reflect back on your key learnings, teachings, what was your biggest hurdle and your biggest success? And what have you learnt from those?
I would say the biggest hurdle was definitely myself, right? It was definitely the fear of failure for me. And I think that fear of failure held me back from taking risks, from talking to different kinds of associates, looking at how we expand into different countries, what kind of partnerships that we wanted to develop. All of those things held me back, right, for the longest time, because I didn't know how to do them. It was the first time, right, that I was learning how to do it. And so I think in a lot of ways, that was the biggest hurdle, is realizing that just because I don't know how to do something doesn't mean that that's not the right thing for me to do for the business, right? That I shouldn't be equating those two things together. I think the biggest lesson for me was letting go, right? And actually trusting other people around me, to kind of get things done.
Kind of like what we were talking about before.
Yeah, that was a big factor for me. I think this is something that I traditionally have never been very good at, right? On a personal level, is kind of just letting go and trusting that other people will actually have your best interests also at heart. Not all the time, right? They've got their own lives and they've got other things they need to do. But to leave yourself open to that, right? Because I think growing up as a young kid, that wasn't always the case, right? The values were very much around, you need to protect yourself, you need to make sure you're going to be okay. And no one was there to, to cover your back in case anything happens. These are all just conversations happening in my head, right? And we talked about, thoughts affect feelings, feelings affect behavior, right?
And 80 to the Stanford study where
82% of the things you worry about never happens. Right. And so all this energy is spent on things that, you could be spending on things that are in your control, right? And I think that was what the purpose of that study was, to show that you don't actually control a lot of the future like you think you do, right? And so you need to step back from that, and worrying, being so anxious about the future, and saying, what can I do today that is going to influence positively, the outcomes that are going to take place.
I think one of the key things that I've read about you, or one of your quotes, is that start running towards success and stop running away from failure. So can you unpack that a little bit more? I guess it is what it sounds like, but
when I got my first graduate job, man, as an intern psych, I was told that I should get into sales, right? Because I had a massive fear of failure from the psychometric tests that I'd done. And so great salespeople have a massive fear of failure, right? That's what drives them, right? And so the problem with that, right, is that though it can be a very strong motivator, it's also deeply energy consuming, right? Because it consumes a lot of your headspace, right? You're constantly running away from failure and worrying about what failure is going to look like, right? If I go and do this. So instead of that, the piece of advice that I was given early on, which didn't really register for like 5 or 6 years, was that start running towards success. It's much more fun, right? And so when I sort of started unpacking that for myself, success meant certain things, certain outcomes, right? It could be about, the certain kind of knowledge that you gain. It could be about accolades. It could be about income. It could be about, other things that were helpful for you and your family, right? Those, of course, are much more pleasing, right, to kind of focus on and think about. However, for me, the fear of failure was always a very strong motivator. I've never lost that. I still think about that to this day, right? It just doesn't occupy as much headspace as it used to. And so for me now, I'm thinking about, well, how many countries do I want to go to this year in 2024, right? How many people do I want to be impacting, right, in a positive way this year? Do I want to be, rewarding myself, with a holiday or something, right? That's going to make sense to me, right? Those are the kind of things that I'm now spending a little bit more time on than I used to. That is also energizing, in a different way, right? Fear of failure is also energizing, but it can be also draining, right? When it's done.
It's like negative reinforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think understanding your own personality style around that is really important, but also knowing that these two extremes can be managed in each of us, right? And sometimes we need to tap into each of those depending on where we are.
So I was listening to that podcast that you were on with Kylie Stone, and she was saying her husband is a cabinet maker, but they have the worst cabinets in their house on the street.
Yeah.
And then you laughed. You guys had a bit of a joke about, are all psychologists the ones with the messiest headspace or the craziest mindsets? Like, is it, as we said at the start, is that idea that psychologists head into the field of psychology to explore their own challenges and mental health issues? Or is it something you think that just like, all weightlifters are short, it's just something you thought? You were intrigued with the mind and that's why you fell into that career.
Yeah, look, there's probably lots of reasons. I'm sure I'll get a slap on the wrist from my psychology fraternity for suggesting that, we've all got head issues and that's why we're all getting into this field. But I think there's definitely a strong motivator, right, to understand ourselves. And that's obviously plays a big role in the selection, right, of career choices. It's not easy to sit down all day, and particularly in the clinical psychology space, to listen to people's problems and carry those with you, right? That is not an easy task. And so I think the pursuit of understanding the mind is a noble one, and it is one that I've, deeply been very privileged, right, to have been involved in, for my professional life. I think each of us, right, get to choose these different elements. I think everyone should study psychology. I mean, I've not met a single job where psychology is not important, right? So I think, it's one of those things where every degree should have psychology as a form of study involved, whether you're engineering, law, accounting, nursing, any profession, right? Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're going to university or not. It's irrelevant, right? So I think there's, we probably have, what I've enjoyed is having some frameworks that I can use for myself that have helped me, right, to guide me in a particular way and to help, the people that I know who are my clients. So I feel very fortunate to do that. I think this is the human condition. It is very hard to be objective about ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. And so the fact that you can then look at somebody else, and this is why it's so great that you can point at other people and we can point out the flaws, right, in other people. It's so obvious, right? Why can't they see what they're doing is wrong, right? Yeah. Except when we look at it through our own internal lens, right? There's massive distortion, right? Because of the experiences we've had, the values we've had, our own violations, whatever they might be, right? I'm working on that book at the moment, called Broken. And the idea is that we're all beautifully broken, right? And there is something in the break or the breaks that we have that actually are the answers to a lot of the questions that we search for within ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the more that we understand the ability to decode that within ourselves, I think the more chances we have of actually achieving much higher potential and excellence, right, in whatever we choose.
You're pretty open about saying that you're so in tuned with outwardly helping other people that you failed to apply a lot of your principles to yourself. Is that a good example of where you've had to, look at maybe some of your potential areas you've had a bit of a downfall and learn
Yeah,
from those areas?
absolutely. My growth is obviously an ongoing, process. It is never going to stop.
Yeah.
And I think I've definitely spent more time becoming more calculated about how I spend time on myself.
Right.
There's a lot of time that I spend, for example, I travel between Dubai and Sydney every month. That is 14 hours of complete isolation.
Right.
I don't put on my phone. I don't work.
Yeah.
I just think. Sometimes I'll write, things to myself. And that is time to myself, right? It's the only time I pretty much get to myself. Otherwise, as soon as I land, we're in sessions. When I'm here, we've got family in sessions. So I think, there's a constant sort of thing. So you got to set up practices that allow you to be able to work, right, in the way that makes sense for you. We're all different, right? If I was to apply what I do, mate, to your life, you probably go, what the hell is this, right? This doesn't make any sense to me, right?
We're all different.
And vice versa, right?
Yeah.
That's just life. So it's the complicated mess that we are as humans.
I guess one of the things I heard recently, similar to what you were just saying there, was try sitting in a car from, when you commute to work, say for that hour, just don't put any music on, just sit within your thoughts for an hour. And I've been doing that. It's really
Yeah.
good. It's really powerful. You sit there, I focus on my breathing. Sometimes I put on some like meditation, try and think about my breathing and stop. I feel it makes sense to try and do it in the car, particularly when often we have a podcast playing, some music playing, or something which often distracting us from those, thoughts in our head. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, there was so one of my favorite quotes, I think, of all time, is from a guy called Pascal, a French philosopher in the
Yeah,
1800s, right? Who said, and his views are a little bit extreme, but all the world's problems
yeah,
come from the fact that we cannot sit alone
yes,
in a room with our thoughts,
yes,
right? And I'm not sure all the world's problems, but I'm sure a lot of them, right, come from the fact that an individual or a group of individuals, we're not comfortable, right, with the idea of the things that pop up in our heads when we're left alone, right? And I think that is a really telling tale, right? There's something going on in there that we need to explore that can potentially help us, right, as to why we're thinking that way, and then that can help us to master those feelings and those behaviors, right, in our lives.
yeah. And I think one of those things that we just talked about was kind of bringing people on into your workforce, um, and talking about how growth and opportunity from a business perspective, also personal growth, comes from those dark places where maybe we've had something that's triggered us to react or emotional in a certain way. We've had to learn from that. Um, when you were, I guess, had to relinquish control and bring people on into your workplace, was that like, releasing the reins? How was that in terms of experience where you had an opportunity to develop personally? Were there any instances there where you kind of had to flex those emotional muscles and really restrain yourself from, disciplining someone or, potentially doing something which would be detrimental to the workplace environment?
Yeah, I remember as you were talking, there's one particular incident that happened a couple of years ago in Saudi. We had a facilitator, one of our consultants, who um, was on a workshop that started at 8 o'clock in the morning. At 8:30, I received a call from the client and said that the consultant had offended four of the women, in that workshop. and that they would like him to be off the program.
Oh.
Right now, this is with the largest oil and gas company in the world. This was with Aramco, all right, at the time, and so obviously a big client for us, right? And so we had to get on the call. Now, I didn't call this person straight away because I was going to jump to all sorts of conclusions. And so I just had to drop a text message, say, hey, we need to chat. Give me a call in 10 minutes. Yeah. And so in the next break, they basically then gave me a call and we had this conversation, right? And I think for me, it was about making sure that I understood that other person's perspective, right? And putting myself in their shoes, right, before making some decisions about them. And we have used that person for other projects after that. But it was in that moment a decision needed to be made. And I needed a little bit of time to process, right, what had happened. Because obviously, initially I was in disbelief, and there was anger and frustration, and all these things were obviously kicking in, right? That, you know, naturally would take place. But ultimately, it was about curiosity for me that took over. And I find that being in a curious state for me on a personal level, I don't know about you, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this, man, as well. That curiosity helps me to answer a lot of things, not only about the situation I'm in, but also about why I choose to behave in a particular way.
Yeah, well, you said that often it's hard for us to be objective about ourselves. So how do we be objective about our opinions? Where are our opinions coming from? So I guess, and also in her experience or her perspective, maybe she wasn't trying to offend or insult. We've talked on previous podcast episodes too about one instance was with Pinchapoo, Kate Austin, and she was talking about how, you know, giving certain products to certain cultural demographics can be seen as offensive, right? So, and that often that's lost in translation or, you know, misinterpreted. I would never know that a tampon is going to insult someone, you know, who is of Muslim background. As you say, better understanding of the
Yeah.
context, the person, where their opinion and interpretation. I think there's a lot of times where, as you say, we're quick to jump to one conclusion. But I think where a lot of these arguments or things go wrong, there's differences between individuals and their viewpoints and values. And it's not necessarily that either of them have done the wrong thing, but it's that because they have, you know, two different viewpoints which juxtapose each other, conflict starts to arise. And so I think it's important that when you have these instances or situations where you have to discipline people, it's important to talk about their own emotional regulation rather than actually the problem at heart. You know, it could have been a number of things: culture, patience with the group decreasing.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important that we get an understanding of the individual before we jump to conclusions and kind of work at their internal regulation processes for their emotions, as opposed to, you know, saying you're right or you're wrong, because we can all, you know, make up a defense for that.
Yeah, I don't know about you, mate. You said some really valid things there. And I think, you know, for me, as I get older, one of the things that I realize is that I'm less interested in right and wrong. What is helpful in that situation, right? And I think starting with that in mind, right, is perhaps for me, I find a much healthier sort of place, right, to kind of start a conversation with. Because ultimately that binary view of right and wrong, someone's going to be in the wrong end of that stick.
Yeah.
Right. And it's never a nice feeling, right? For those of us who are married or, you know, engaged or whatever, as men, it's never a nice feeling, right? When we're told that it's wrong. So it's yeah, that was a bad attempt at a joke, but I think there's an element of, you know,
your wife's going to slap you.
I think she's used to me just having a go at her on these podcasts, mate. It's the only chance I get. You can tell I'm gutless because I can't do it in front of her.
She probably gets anxiety when she sees the stories pop up. Gage Ravichandra, you know, next episode to listen to.
Yeah. Psychologist has a go at his wife. Yeah, look, I think so. It's interesting, you know, the less binary that we accept the world is,
Yeah.
right? And the more that we try and find somewhere on that continuum that works, right, for us, right? I think that's where I find is the greatest opportunity.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that we were talking about before was the fact that growth comes from dark places. But I
Mm,
think it's important. I think one thing we've kind of haven't discussed enough of just yet, we've talked a lot about mindset mastery in the individual, but there needs to be good leadership, I find. It's like if something's festering and you don't address it properly, it becomes a bigger problem.
mm,
How important is good leadership? And I think it's quite ironic. You look at the term leadership and leader of the vessel or the ship. I think I've heard you spoken about this before, but it's like almost a conglomerate between the body and the mind. So,
mm,
um, tell us about some important, I guess, tips and strategies for developing good leadership skills,
mm.
and how can we promote that in all settings? Yeah,
Yeah. So yeah, I think for me, leadership is one of the most selfless activities, right, that you can take on. It is also one of the most loneliest
yeah,
activities, right, that you can take on.
yeah,
And the reason for that is because of this idea that leaders have to put a pole in the ground somewhere of where they stand, right? They have to be very clear about what they stand for, about what is important, about the vision of what they're trying to achieve, right? And whereas other people around them, including their direct reports and everyone else, can run around that pole, they can't move from that pole, right? Because as soon as they start showing inconsistency,
yeah,
then there's confusion, right, about what's going on. That one day they can act like this, and one day they're here, and therefore, there's all sorts of, it creates a mess, right, in its sort of organizational structure, but also in our own minds as we're following leaders. So I think that becomes, leadership from that perspective is a very difficult task. And you're also having to then deal with more complex issues, right? So a leader tends to be somebody who also then has to deal with a lot of variables, right? And so therefore that creates a lot of complexity, right, into the nature of the job. And I think that part for me is what's really interesting is how do you then, we talked about creating more certainty in uncertain situations. I think that is something that you need to do as a leader. That's vital. A lot of that comes down to communication, man,
yeah,
right? The idea that you can sit down with your people and create an environment where conversations are welcome, where you can actually debate things, where people feel safe to be able to communicate,
yeah,
that you hold people accountable for the things that are happening around you, that you remove the obstacles that are getting in the way of your people achieving what they need to achieve as well, right? And that pretty much links back to this idea of when you look at a leader's role in a high performance culture or environment,
yeah,
there are two typical levers, right? You need to have high challenge. You need to provide challenge to your people, but at the same time, you need to provide support, right? And that support could mean different things. It could mean emotional support. It could mean physically being present, right? It could mean the right resources. It could mean budgetary allowance, right? It could mean technology. It could mean access to people, right? So there's a whole bunch of things as a leader that, if you can match the support with the challenge that is being provided, then I think you do a much better job, right, of getting your people to where they need to be.
And then I guess in insidious forms of governance, you look in workplaces, the corporate workplaces that might be driven solely by KPIs centered around financial goals. What kind of idealistic leader would run an environment where you have a workplace full of happy or thriving work colleagues and employees?
Yeah, so this
What's
is
the ideal?
there's no blanket rule, right? Because I think a lot of it comes down to aligning it to the values and motivators of
Yeah,
people. So for example, some people might want to be rewarded monetarily, right, for doing a good job. For others, it's not as important. It for them it might be, can I work from home 2 days a week, right? That's going to be more important to me. For another person, it might be that I just want to have a growth plan or a career plan, right, for the next 5 years. For another person, it could be autonomy, right? I just want to be left alone, right, to kind of do what I need to do. So I think a leader's role really in lots of ways is to, create that environment where that safety is there, but at the same time, to kind of align it to, being able to push the buttons of each person depending on what they are motivated by, right, and what's important to them. So I think, there are some finding some common ground. And I'm having a lot of those conversations right now, right? It's the beginning of the year. So a lot of leaders having these discussions off sites, talking to people about what are we going to do for the rest of the year? How do we want to plan things? And then setting some minimum expectations around behavior, right? And outcomes. And, and if you get people to sign off on that and everyone agrees, right, on that sort of minimum standard, that benchmark, at least you've got a lowest point, right? Because what tends to happen during stress is that people tend to drop to the lowest point that's accepted.
Yeah.
All right. So if you keep that point high, at least reasonably high, then we can all hold each other accountable as a team, right? Not just the leader.
What do you think? I think relatable to that, what you just discussed there, but quiet quitting. A lot of people, there's this terminology now about quiet quitting where people just do the bare minimum to get by. Are you seeing more of that when people are pushed to the brink of their bandwidth?
Yeah. I think with quiet quitting, I think it happens mostly for a couple of reasons. One is that they're not able to find another job, right, that is better suited to them. Because if they did, they'd leave, right, in most cases. The second is that people are a bit nervous, right, about that change because of the fact that maybe there's a bit of instability in the economy. There's, obviously, redundancies and so forth taking place, across a number of industries at the moment. So that instability, I think, has resulted in people staying put, right, where they are. And their way of dealing with, that kind of the fact that they are stuck or seemingly stuck, right, in the organization is to survive. And the way to survive is to do the minimum amount of work that they need to do so that they can just get through, right? And so, it's really sad, right, when you see that taking place. And I always, when I have discussions with leaders about this, it is to really have the honest conversation with those employees, because it is not only unhelpful for the organization or the team and demoralizing for team members, but it's also it doesn't shed a very good light on that individual who is participating in that quiet quitting either, right? It actually ruins their brand, their professional and personal brand as a result of that. And sometimes I don't think people consider the collateral damage that takes place from that quiet quitting sort of practice, right? You are actually damaging your professional brand as a result of that.
You mean as an individual?
As an individual.
Also, yeah.
Yeah.
Or of like your reputation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to wrap things up, a couple of questions that we have for you. Some educational sites that are going to take your learning to the next level. If you had to quick fire a couple of different tools that people can use.
Yeah, the couple of so there's a couple of sites that I think are really good. So Coursera, which is a particular platform that a number of educational institutions have signed up. So that's course and then ra.org, and I think is really fantastic. LinkedIn has developed massively, right, their learning platform of late, and I think that's been really positive to be able to do, and to find some tools that you can use. I find with platforms like Udemy and so forth that they're not really so great on sort of deeper learning. I find that to be a bit of a challenge. So that's a bit of an issue. But some of the other ones like Masterclass, you see these Masterclass, kind of ones coming up on strategy and leadership development. I think those bite-sized learning elements are really good. I would always recommend people, if they're interested in going on these sort of leadership programs, to try and pick one that is going to take them out of their comfort zone a little bit, right? So you might find, for example, that, like Harvard and Stanford, INSEAD, a number of these programs, they'll have these sort of online programs now where you can actually do some collaborative work online. But the value of those kind of programs is not necessarily the content, right? For me, I find it's the alumni, right, that you get to spend some time with. And that is something that is really powerful, that I've noticed working with the business schools. Content is content. Most of that information is accessible, right, in most places. It's fairly ubiquitous, right? However, who you spend your time with is really valuable, right? And so getting access to some of these individuals, I think can be a really good practice.
What about some websites to elevate your career?
Yeah, so there are a few. I think I did a couple of TikToks on a few of these, right? That sort of sort of identified a few of these for people. I think some of the best ones that I tend to find are really linked to a lot of the universities. They have a lot of these career portals and information that you can tap into, that can be really helpful for you. There's one called ONET, right? Which is really quite good. ONET actually provides you with, particularly if you're thinking about what kind of jobs would I be interested in, what kind of areas are interesting and relevant. You can actually type a whole bunch of different characteristics of, job descriptions and things that you're interested in, and it can actually spit out for you the jobs that are the most similar, right, to that. So it can help you in terms of trying to align, the kinds of jobs by the nature of the work you do, and maybe even looking at the kinds of industries, right, that align to that. I would always suggest get a career coach, right? They have tools and techniques. I'm not trying to sell myself, but there are reasons why career coaches exist. And I think they tend to have tools and techniques that are really helpful around firstly knowing yourself, getting to know yourself, and then how I sell myself, right, to the right organizations as well. And these are two different skill sets, right, that you need to develop.
Fantastic, mate. And the last one we've got is how, as an individual, do you most effectively set boundaries for yourself?
So boundaries for me is very much around knowing what is the lowest acceptable behavior, right, that you want to tolerate. And as soon as you set the lowest minimum standard and understanding what that means, I think you can then start to navigate around with the people who are demonstrating, above that. And those who demonstrate below that, do not tolerate that behavior. And I don't mean you do that in a way that is aggressive. You can actually go and have a conversation with that individual specifically about what that thing was, right? Because once you've understood for yourself what those minimum standards are, then it's much easier for you to articulate to that person what was the issue, right, with that particular course of action or the way they spoke or whatever it might have been, and then how you want to deal with that. So it is no one else's responsibility except your own to set those boundaries, and you need to be able to articulate those boundaries. But to do that, you need to have introspected. You need to have asked yourself those questions, right, about what's important to you.
Fantastic, guys. Thanks for today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Before we go, one song that you would add to the Normless playlist. All of our guests have done it. Is there any music you're listening to at the moment that you're a fan of that you would add to the Normless playlist?
Oh, there is an Elton John song. I don't know if you've even got it on there. What's the one there that I used it recently when we did a mental toughness workshop. It is called "I'm Still Standing."
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, add it on, man.
Add that one to the playlist.
Yeah.
And it's been, as I said, been an absolute pleasure, mate. Thanks for your time today. And I'll let you jump into your next meeting now.
Thank you, mate. I really appreciate it, and love what you do, mate. And looking forward to catching up.